Hey everybody, it's Yu-Gi-Oh! Master 88 here, and welcome to episode number 1 of my new podcast, the Linux Roundtable podcast. I am your host, Yu-Gi-Oh! Master 88, along with Ben and Red. Say hello, gentlemen.
Hello, hello, gentlemen.
Oh,
and,
I had to say that.
okay. Anyway, folks. Um. Um. Here's the deal here. I did record episode 1 a while back, but I lost the footage, so we're having to re-record episode 1. So, for all intents and purposes, let's get started. So, for the first inaugural edition of the Linux Roundtable podcast, today's main topic is the wonderful world of Archlinux. So, um, before we get into the nitty gritty of Archlinux, I just want to say, for those that are watching this new podcast for the very first time, this is basically going to have some historical information along with other types of information about Arch Linux. So if anybody gets confused on anything that we say, we're going to try to be as clear with this information to the best of our ability. Another thing I also want to say as well is um to those that are pretty much either in the process or going to be in the process of trying Arch Linux for the very first time, I would highly recommend you watch this podcast first, because there will be some tutorial-esque aspects that we are going to be talking about in regards to Arch Linux, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, with all the prerequisites out of the way, let's get started. So, most of you might be wondering, what is Arch Linux? Arch Linux, it is a Linux distribution. It's been around since 2002, long before basically I came into the Linux community, long before Ben came into the Linux community. Most likely long before Red was in the Linux community. That's how old Arch Linux is, because Arch Linux is pretty much literally over 2 decades old at this point. Basically, back in its heyday when it first started, it was at first, early in its life, highly regarded as a very good Linux distro, because back then, you could essentially, for all intents and purposes, make it however you want. Like, back then, from what I've gathered in my research of Arch Linux, it used to have what was known at that time as an incursus installer, which most Linux distros don't have that anymore. I mean, sure, an incursus installer in some distros still exists, but basically, that type of installation has been phased out altogether, with other installation methods, like, for example, the Arch installer script, which Arch Linux released a number of years ago, which is very popular now, as basically what I like to call the devil installer, Calamaris. But aside from the old incursus installer that Arch Linux used to have, in its early heyday, it had a nice abundance of software. Sure, back then they didn't have a good web browser, but there were some web browsers that were decent for that time, like the old Dillo web browser, which was a very old web browser. It would be years, before Archlinux got a good web browser, aka Firefox, which is very popular with Linux distros. It's practically one of the main web browsers that most distros install, aside from Chromium, of course. But fast forward pretty much a good few decades later, Arch Linux basically has been forked like a bajillion times. I mean, there's many Arch distributions out there, like, for example, our distribution, StormOS, of course, as well as, Arco Linux, the old Crunch Bang, which recently resurfaced not long ago, Arco Linux, which I don't even know why they named their Linux distro after a type of like an oil company, Arco. I don't get why they named it like that. I don't know. But anyway, there's also Garuda Linux as well. There's many different Arch distributions out there. Some are more difficult than others, and some are more easier than others. It pretty much depends on like what type of distro you pick, because each Linux distro comes with its own difficulty, especially when you're dealing with Arch Linux based distributions. Each Arch distro is either going to be easier than the next one or more difficult than the next one. Do you want to say anything about that, Benny? Ben?
No, you pretty much said it right as can be.
Oh, okay. Okay. Another thing that I want to point out as well, folks, when it comes to Arch Linux, and I can't stress this enough, and as Ben and Red as my witnesses, and I should know because I've had to go through this many times myself, if you're coming into Arch Linux for the very first time, please read the documentation, read the Arch Wiki, and look at the installation guide that archlinux.org has, because there's a lot of good documentation on there, folks, that you're going to need to know if you're going to start using a Linux distro like Arch. Like, it's not like, Ubuntu or Debian to where, installation is automated. With Arch Linux, you pretty much got to get your hands in the water, and you have to pretty much do what's called a manual installation. You have to build everything yourself. And what I mean by that is you got to pretty much build the base programs. You got to build your grub out. You got to pretty much make sure you have all the packages you're going to need. It can be time consuming depending on like how many packages you need for your particular machine. You may need a lot of packages, or you may need a little bit of packages. It depends. And not all computers are created equal here, folks. Especially for those individuals, who are still using 32-bit architectures. Unfortunately, with 32-bit folks, while there are still Linux distros that still support 32-bit, unfortunately, the 32-bit architecture is slowly being phased out completely because it's an old architecture. It's not being used much anymore. Unless, you're one of those people that still uses either Windows 7 or Windows XP, which in my opinion are two of the best versions of Windows ever, aside from Windows 10 when modified with the Chris Titus Text WinUtil. But back to Arch Linux. One other thing about Arch Linux that you all need to know as well, besides the what I just said, is a lot of the software in Arch Linux is bleeding edge. Now, what do I mean by bleeding edge? Bleeding edge is essentially, for all intents and purposes, the most stable, up-to-date version of the software is humanly possible. Now, there can be some advantages and disadvantages to running bleeding edge software. The advantage of running bleeding edge software when it comes to Arch Linux is you're going to get the latest packages at the latest versions. Like, for example, the latest version of Firefox, or LibreOffice, or Mousepad, as examples. Now, the disadvantages to running bleeding edge software is, unfortunately, bleeding edge software is prone to breakage. It happens. Like, your web browser could break, or your text editor could break, or your Office suite could break. It can happen with bleeding edge software. Now, when it's stable software, the chances of a stable version breaking is much slimmer than a bleeding edge. Am I right, Red?
Yes, sir. I agree with you. Yes, it can break at any time.
Um, another thing about Arch Linux as well, folks. The cool thing about Arch is, unlike, Debian, Ubuntu, Slackware, and all the other Linux families, the one cool thing about Arch Linux, folks, is it has in my opinion, the most diverse option of window managers, desktop environments, and Wayland compositors out of any Linux family I've ever seen. Like, you pretty much, folks, have so many options as to what you want your Linux interface to look like. Like, you have KDE, you have XFCE, and you also have Hyperland. You also have Wayfire. And for window managers, you have two of my favorite ones of all time, i3 and OpenBox. But those are just the tip of the iceberg. Your Linux interface can look amazing depending on what you choose. And that is why I like Arch Linux, because you have the most diverse options of window managers, Wayland compositors, and desktop environments. You can get a lot of those options with Debian, but when it comes to Ubuntu and Slackware and all these other Linux families, the options can be fewer or far between. So that's why I like Arch Linux, is it gives you the power to completely customize your computer how you want it to. Now, also, and I just thought of this just now. One unique thing about Arch Linux is basically not just, its longevity, or basically how much it comes with. It's essentially, oh dear. I just lost my train of thought there. I had it, but then it went,
It happens.
Anyway, it happens. But anyway, the point being, folks, is not just for its longevity or how much software it has, but Arch Linux has one of the biggest communities you will ever find in Linux. Now, this is not, to judge people. This is not to offend people. That's not where I'm going with this. But the one thing about the Arch Linux community is you have to be careful, because There are some people in the community, not naming names because we're not going to name names here, that pretty much say that pretty much tell most new Arch Linux users RTFM. In my honest opinion, that's the wrong thing to do to a new Arch Linux user. What people should do, in my honest opinion, is if you're new to Arch Linux, guide them through the experience on their first time out, show them what they need to do. This way, the next time around, they'll be able to do it on their own. Here's a good example, folks. When on my first outing with Arch Linux, Benny Boy here had to help me through the whole thing. It took 2 times for it to sink in my head to where going forward I could do Arch Linux all by myself. And just letting you know, folks, I've only been a Linux user since 2018. So that should give you a bit of context as to how much experience I have. But ever since I've done it by myself for the first time, like in 2018, 2019, I've done Arch Linux all by myself many, 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 many times. I mean, you know the old saying, folks, practice makes perfect. So the point being is, when it comes to Arch Linux, I mean, when it comes to the community, you're going to have some good eggs, you're going to have some bad eggs. But at the end of the day, um the way I see the community as a whole, if we just come together and help the new Arch Linux users on their first time out with Arch Linux, getting to know the installation process, getting to know how they want their computer to be, it's gonna be better in the long term. Trust me on that. One other thing I do want to point out as well is unlike Ubuntu, unlike Slackware, unlike Gentoo, unlike LFS, and unlike Debian, the cool thing about Arch Linux is the number of kernel options it has. Like, I've never seen so many Linux kernels in my entire life, and Arch Linux has so many to choose from. I mean, you got your normal kernel, you got the LTS kernel, you got the Lycurix kernel if you want to go into a more gaming direction. There's also the Zen kernel for gaming as well. You got so many kernels to choose from. It's like endless at this point. Um, so yeah, the one thing I want to say about Arch Linux is it is an amazing OS, and it's going to be continue being amazing for many, many years to come, and I can't wait to see what the future holds for Arch Linux in about 5 to 10 years from now, especially when in 2026, we're going to be getting our very first web browser that is not Chromium based, that is not Firefox based, called Ladybird. And I cannot wait to see what that project is going to be like when it comes to Arch Linux. So, anyway, do you or Ben have any final thoughts before we wrap up episode 1?
Nah.
No, good.
Okay, then I think what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to wrap up episode 1 of the Linux Roundtable podcast, Arch Linux. I thank you all so much for watching, so much for coming. If you enjoy these just as much as we do, then smash that like button, ring-a-ding that notification bell, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Just letting everybody know, I have a Patreon now. I'm gonna start pushing out the content for both the Green Penguin tier and the Red Penguin tier very, very soon. Just letting everybody know, the Green Penguin tier, it's a free $3 monthly membership, and the Red Penguin tier is a $5 monthly membership. So pick whichever one you like. And also I will be doing simultaneous YouTube Patreon releases from time to time, so keep a lookout for that as well. But anyway, we're gonna get on out of here. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, this is Yu-Gi-Oh! Master 88 saying see you later. Have a good night, everybody,
Well,
and we will see
good night,
you
guys.
on episode number 2. Bye-bye.